Welcome to Temple University Japan campus. I'm Robert Dejarek, run ICAS. Just a few things. If you haven't put your phone on vibrate or silent mode, please do so. In case there's an earthquake, the safest thing to do is to hide under your chair because you can always be hit by falling objects. And then if and when it's necessary, we will evacuate to our garden on the other side. But the best thing to do during an earthquake is actually not to move, because if you were to leave, you could be hit, or you could also fall because of the tremors. Without further ado, I will give the floor to my friend and colleague, Professor Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to speak third this evening, but I thought I would make a few introductory remarks. So firstly, thank you all very much for coming, and also for many of you it will be the first time you're here at our new building, so welcome to the new home of TUJ. I was the organizer of this evening's event in terms of the content, so I wanted to explain what the idea was. And we have so many events taking place in various areas to do with Japan-Russia relations that focus narrowly on the territorial question. Now, inevitably, whenever you talk about this bilateral relationship, you end up talking about the islands issue. But really what I wanted to emphasize is that this was just one aspect of the relationship. And so in the three presentations that we have this evening, yes, the islands issue certainly will be mentioned, will be talked about. But also there will be a focus on military, economic, social, and broader political issues as well. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be speaking third, so you'll hear from me again in due course. First of all, however, it's my pleasure to welcome Yu Koizumi, who's an assistant professor at the University of Tokyo and is a leading expert on the Russian military. He describes himself as a military geek. And so if you want to know details to do with Russian missiles, military issues, he's very much a person to speak with. So the title of his talk this evening is Russian Military Posture in the Northern Territories. He'll speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you.
Good evening. This is Yu Koizumi from Tokyo University. My specialty is, as Dr. Brown introduced, is military affairs of Russia. And so today, I would like to report on Russia's military posture in our northern territory, the 4 islands disputed between Russia and Japan, Kunashiri, Etorofu, Shikotan, and Habomai. First, let's get started with a brief history. After the invasion in 1945 into 4 islands, main part of Soviet occupation forces had withdrawn in 1950s, remaining an air regiment in Etorofu. However, in 1970s, Soviet redeployed ground unit called 18th Machine Gun Artillery Division, placing 3 regiment components in Kunashiri, Etorofu, and Shikotan. The timing is quite interesting because Soviet Navy had opened its nuclear submarine base in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, eastern coast of Kamchatka. Those were strategic submarines to guarantee Soviet second strike capability in the case of the US first strike. So the Okhotsk Sea, surrounded by Kuril Islands, became the nuclear bastion to deploy those strategic subs, and the forces in 4 islands got new mission, bulwark of bastion. Similar bastions were built in the Arctic Sea, like this. This is the nuclear bastion in Okhotsk and the one in Arctic Sea. After the end of the Cold War, Russian forces experienced hard error. Budget was cut, soldiers and officers' morale were deteriorated, and the weapons and infrastructure were getting obsolete. Force size has dramatically shrunk. An air regiment in Etorofu was dismantled, and the total troops were cut from 10,000 strong to just 3,500. It was the 2010s that new development have started. Sorry. While Russian government launched a comprehensive socio-economic development program, Russian military proposed the fourth modernization plan to the president. The plan, approved in 2012, was consisted from 3 pillars. The first one is the infrastructure. Russian garrisons in Ireland were heavily struck by a huge earthquake off the Hokkaido in 1994, and they had been almost intact after that. In addition, infrastructure modernization was required to improve living standard of personnel and attract officers and contract soldiers for serving in those islands. And new operational infrastructure were also needed for newly deployed military assets that I will mention later. Second pillar was the territorial defense capability, forced to defend the island itself. Vast but obsolete weapons and equipment were replaced by new ones, including T-80VV tanks, TOW-M2U field air defense systems, while force size itself was not increased. Final and the most important pillar is anti-access and area denial capabilities, that A2AD capabilities that mean the asset to control entire area around Okhotsk. Recently, Russia has invested enormous resources for building such capabilities like that. In the Arctic, Baltic, Black Sea, and Mediterranean theater, like shown here, and force modernization in Northern Territory can be interpreted as a part of such efforts. Generally speaking, the A2AD networks a defense line to protect Russia's strategically important areas. For example, A2AD asset in Black Sea is clearly to protect the Russian forces in Crimea, eastern Ukraine, or other Russia's military intervention in the post-Soviet states, post-Soviet space, including Georgia, Chechen, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and so on. And Russia is recently building such capability on the shore of Syria. Of course, it is for protect the intervention forces in the countries. In the case of Northern Territory, along with the Arctic, those assets are considered to be dedicated to protection of Navy's strategic submarine fleets, patrolling the Arctic and Okhotsk Sea. So it is a revival of bastion strategy. Let's see back those maps. This is the posture in Cold War era, but its bastion is not changed even after the Cold War. Of course, Russia's strategic submarine fleet has been Kamchatka even after the Cold War, and Okhotsk also has been bastion. However, there appears some new situation that make the bastion important for Russia again. First, and the most important factor is the rising need for countering the US military supremacy. While Russia is rapidly modernizing its conventional forces, their size and capability are far from the US and its allies' vast high-tech power. Considering today's and expected Russia's financial capability, it's quite improbable for them to catch up the West. That's why Russia has heavily invested to nuclear forces. Even in 2000, when relationship with the West was far better than today, top priority of Russian force modernization program was the strategic nuclear forces, and importance of the nuclear weapon has dramatically risen after the Ukrainian crisis. Now, Russia is in Russia, it is ongoing the new armament program called GPB 2027. So its top priority is also strategic nuclear weapons, including strategic subs, new strategic bombers, new intercontinental ballistic missiles. And of course, Russia's nuclear-powered cruise missile that has recently crashed in the Arctic Sea is a part of such efforts. Secondly, military build-ups in Northern Territory could be seen as the political message to Japan. We never give up the islands. So let's see today's Russian military posture in Northern Territory. Their headquarters is located in the center of the Etorov Island called Garyachi Krychi. And 2 regiments under it are deployed in Etorov and Kunashiri. And as I mentioned, 1 regiment that was deployed in Shikotan was already withdrawn after the Cold War. As already mentioned, those forces have received some new weapons since 2010, but force size is not changed. On the other hand, sea and air assets have been increased to some extent. For example, in 2016, Russia has deployed a new Bastion long-range coastal defense system in Etorov. That is the Navy unit. And BAO in Kunashiri. This is also Navy unit. And it was the first deployment of such asset in Kunashiri, while there has been an obsolete Rubesh coastal defense system in Etorov since Cold War era. And in the summer of 2018, 3 Sukhoi 35S fighter jets were deployed in Yasny Airport in Etorov, which was assigned to civil military use in the beginning of the year. This is a satellite photo I purchased from United States satellite imagery service company. You can clearly see Sukhoi 35S there. And on the same year, Russia temporarily deployed Sukhoi 25 attack jet in Brevestnik military airfield there. This is the first permanent deployment of fixed-wing aircraft in Northern Territory in this 25 year. While they have been deployed some helicopters in Brevestnik airfield. I consider the movement is related to the Vostok 2018 military exercise held in Eastern Military District in this period, while Russian MOD claims that the Northern Territory was not included in the exercise area. So let's conclude my presentation with the future vision. This is the general picture of a current air-to-air deployment around Okhotsk Sea. You can find that area is partially covered by air and the coastal defense system. For example, now they have deployed S-400 system and S-300 air defense system in Vladivostok, Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, and Sakhalin. And now they have 3 Bastion unit in those areas. But there are huge blank, you can see. And this is the expected future posture. It is reported that Russia is preparing the additional deployment of Bastion coastal defense system in Sakhalin and somewhere in another island in Kuril Island chain. Potential candidate for the latter would be Paramushir is here, or Matua Island here, where Russian MOD has recently dispatched a series of expeditionary units. So I think they are now searching the candidate site for deployment of those air-to-air assets. And I think those assets require long-range air defense system to cover them. Considering huge military values I explained in this presentation, so they should be covered by such systems such as like S-400 or obsolete S-300 or potentially advanced S-500 that now Russia is developing. And again, considering those military postures and its high value of the Okhotsk Sea as a nuclear bastion, Russian generals and admirals wouldn't be quite happy with any territorial resolution with Japan. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I should explain that we're going to keep the presentations really as short as possible. There will be a lot of time at the end to ask questions. So there was a lot of there's a wealth of information there. If you want to go into it in more detail, you can ask questions towards the end. Now, however, we're going to move on to our second presenter, Dr. Elena Shadrina, Associate Professor at Waseda University, who will be speaking on what to expect from Russia-Japan relations, contemplation against a background of social and economic situation in Russia.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for coming this evening to this event. That's the first time I'm going to speak here, although I've been many, many times among the audience in this very great environment of ICAS. So, indeed, as Professor Brown has introduced, I'm going to speak on the topics related to Russia-Japan relations, but mainly having a perspective on what is going on in Russia itself. And because I'm an economist, I'm going to keep that focus strictly linked to economy and social developments. I'm using some maps, that's why I have this kind of disclaimer. All right, so I'm going to go to specifically go through 3 points: economic situation, demographic trends, and societal dynamics. And as sometimes is the case when speaker goes on and audience is wondering what the speaker wants to say, I decided to put it straight away. So the key message of my presentation would be that Russia's contemporary social and economic context is not allowing for much optimism, for bright prospects for Russian-Japanese economic relations or political and diplomatic breakthrough. So I'm going to be a little bit more specific on all these points I made. First of all of you, I am quite strongly believing in that, well familiar with the case that Russia is very dependent on resources. And the title friend-dependent economy with weak institutions is something which is a well-known fact among scholars and those who have some interest in Russian studies. Certainly there are recent developments involving sanctions and counter-sanctions, the topic which was covered by several speakers here at the ICAS venue, is also making additional hardships on Russian economy, creates more challenges for the Russian government how to manage these challenges. And effectively, and the saddest part of the story would be that the final recipients of the hardships would be just ordinary citizens, Russians, who are more and more sensing their economic and other hardships, which I would speak a little bit more towards the end of my talk. One more point which I want to make quite clear is about regional disparities, and this is also a known fact that when we consider Russian territory being very, very large, but at the same time we know that the population of Russia is not as significant, and if we take a point of economic and social development, we are even more concerned about the disparity of those terms. In recent years, indeed, the Russian government was more active trying to address this regional disparity, bringing up their idea of territories of advanced development. Some of those projects were initiated in the Far East, the closest to Japan region as well. So far, we would not be so confident, so proud to report on particular achievements. Nonetheless, their policies are certainly in place. One more focus which I want to make more clear is about ongoing demographic shifts. In Russia, we are considering rather unfavorable trends here. We speak of low fertility rates, we speak of decline in population. We also consider they're already looming quite obviously shortage of working age population. These kind of trends are more and more familiar in the context of, for instance, countries like Japan, but in Russia too, we do have these kind of concerns. So we speak of the context, economic and social, such that objectively sets certain limits on their potential for Russian-Japanese economic relations. Obviously, because the closest region is underdeveloped and overall trends such as I briefly went through. At the same time, we need also to be specific that in the most recent years, after the year 2014, and I'm quite certain that the audience makes very strong association with the developments which took place back then, their situation, social situation started also to have its toll on their people's desire to support political power in place, and very often people, especially sensing their hardships associated with the sanctions and associated with some restrictions imposed in the course of elections, as was the case this summer with municipal elections in Moscow. People start sensing more dissatisfaction, disappointment, and we do have actually quite pronounced trend for immigration in Russia. So these kind of stances which would to do with social and economic, and would have to do with the domestic political situation. By no means I mean that there is a trend for some very strong opposition, and there is a possibility for some domestic political crisis. Not, but at the same time, their approval rates are declining, and that becomes certainly of a concern to the government. So speaking of economic trends now, which I am going to be a little bit more detailed and presenting some illustration to support my points. Certainly, the topics of the Russian economy being not as strong as it used to be before the global crisis, I would specifically would like to point out at this period. We see that after the global economic crisis, Russia did recover a little bit in terms of growth, but never was doing as good as it used to do in the earlier 2000s. At the same time, we would mention that the prospects for growth remain rather modest, and these are the projections by their World Bank and IMF. Nonetheless, the Russian government would perhaps have even less confidence in the fact that it's going to happen. Here I would like also to demonstrate that these are the data which might be not so important to you, but I just wanted to point out that if we consider two periods, earlier 2000 through the year 2008 and afterwards, we see quite a significant decline along all these kind of parameters: GDP per capita, labor utilization, and all other parameters to consider. An important observation is about Gini coefficient, which characterizes their level of poverty, and we would obviously see that it's increasing. This illustration is a little bit informative in a way that it shows how much Russia lags behind the OECD countries in terms of productivity, GDP per capita, and GDP per worker, quite well explaining their strengths of their economy. I won't be stopping much on these slides. Just this, I think, is a very clear illustration of what makes Russia to claim sometimes their strong position in the world economy. Indeed, in terms of resources, energy resources, it does lead. early on I pointed that economic strengths in one particular area of specialization, energy, and the problems with the regional uneven level of development across Russia's regions. This illustration quite well presents these points. First of all, we see indeed large resources being export-oriented, and we see that quite large parts of Russia is effectively not engaged much. That picture was for gas, and this illustration is for the network of oil pipelines. Similar idea could be learned here. Again, speaking of the importance of energy as such is certainly a matter, but we do believe that it provides significant financial support to the Russian government. In fact, if we consider more closely this aspect, we would notice that there is kind of, first of all, a trend for their oil and gas revenues being not as important, playing, let's say, less significant role than non-oil and gas revenues. And one more point to make here is that it seems that over time, lack of investment in their geological exploration resulted in the fact that Russia faces quite definite possibility of decline in oil production. And in order to assist their oil producers, the government usually provides different kind of tax breaks. And here the illustration showing how much of that support is being extended. Roughly speaking, more than 40% of oil now these days produced is being produced with the assistance of different kind of tax subsidies and supports from the government. So in other words, we would notice that on their connection energy economy, there are certainly quite deep problems. This is just to support what I have earlier mentioned. So as a result of that, if we consider how Russia is involved into their world economy, an obvious fact, again, would be how much, what the structure of Russia's export, and it's mainly presented by their crude petroleum or refined petroleum. If we consider who are the principal partners in here, those countries which are in Asia, China by far the largest as a partner. In Europe, Netherlands traditionally were their country with who Russia is mostly linked by exports contracts. Speaking of imports, here again, what is quite well known that the principal share of import is machinery and equipment. And speaking of their partners, principal partners, again in Asia it would be China, and in Germany and in Europe it will be Germany. And this aspect actually made the topic of sanctions quite sensitive and painful for Russian economy, because as speakers have been presenting these ideas early on, the sanctions were eventually created in a way to be targeted at those sectors which are most principal and depend on their imported equipment, technologies for their exploration, for the drilling, and things like that. One more point which I need to make, characterizing the Russian economy, obviously in the years following the ICAS case of 2003, there was a trend towards strengthening the role of the government in the economy. Just recently published ranking of the largest companies in Russian economy. We have national RBK agency which does this kind of rankings. I certainly I borrowed it from Wikipedia because it was just the most updated and so on. What I wanted to you to pay attention to, that if we look at their largest companies, obviously we will notice that most of them in one way or another are energy companies or transport companies, and companies like power engineering. Speaking of location, again, this regional disparity is quite well be sensed through this presentation. Again, their role of big, large state-owned companies in Russian economy is becoming more and more significant. And here are some facts proving that the largest revenue is being earned, and the growth of revenue is the largest among these huge companies with state participation. So certainly, looking at Russia from outside, we very often rely on their different rankings which are provided by different institutions, such as, for instance, ease of doing business. We see here that Russia is given rank 31 out of this many countries ranked. In fact, it's not so bad in comparison to other rankings Russia has. Strong points are being identified about access to energy and about registering property, but there are quite many lowly ranked positions which have to do with starting a business or doing with construction facilities, or authorities rather. Speaking of the index of economic freedom, we see that Russia's rank is quite low, 98 out of 180 countries. And again, their points of concern would be financial freedom and government integrity. One more on this account about corruption perception. So we see here quite low position of Russia, with rating becoming even improved a little bit, but nonetheless not so much better. So speaking of demography, I on purpose picked up this couple of maps just to make it more visible, the point which I made about the disparity in regional development, and this goes very, very clear when we speak of the density of population. Three parts here would be equal in population. Here, the population is equal to only one city, Moscow. And here, if we would have density like in Moscow, all population of Russia would be placed here. This is a trend in terms of their population as such. In recent years, the government also attempts to somehow improve this demographic picture. Since the year 2007, the government practices so-called the maternity capital program, which is very generous, I would say, in terms of the payments which are offered to every family which decides to have a second and more children. But the outcomes were not as optimistic so far. That's why in the most recent years, the government seemed to be favoring the idea of opening up the doors and inviting more immigrants. So I have mentioned the points of concerns about working age population decline. These are projections through the year 2035, and we can clearly see that it becomes a problem, and that's why just very, very recently, the Russian government eventually, quite at a very fast track, has endorsed a law about pension age increase. And it's going to happen in a rather, indeed, quick fashion, much faster than it's accustomed to be done in other countries. So as I said, their hardships in the country and their societal sentiment about their situation in Russia itself, and in that connection we could mention quite many specific events. I would perhaps do that in a while. We would see that there is a kind of higher inclination of their population to immigrate. That doesn't mean necessarily that they would do, but speaking of their intentions, it's indeed so. And if we consider their age structure, the youngest are 44% are speaking about that. Bits of kind of deeper look into migration immigration from Russia. Statistics showing that there is big discrepancy between data in Russia and in such countries as US and Germany, those who are receiving the largest flows of immigrants from Russia. So as I said, there was a trend of decline in support of president himself. These are the Levada Center, very well-known research poll center, which does this kind of polls and posts it on their website. And also the question about probability of protests with political claims and whether people would participate or not. This also give us some better sense of their ongoing trends. I also would like to make just a few brief comments about how the society is indeed changing. Like in many other developed countries, in Russia, people are now less and less trusting to the TV or relying on TV for the news and for the very important other informational provisions. So more and more people switch to their internet and SNS. And here we see that assessment of TV, for instance, by those who were asked by Levada Center, is that it is quite biased. And this often makes people consider other means of information. In recent years, and this to confirm to some extent, or to give you a little bit better ground of why my claims were like that their society is indeed maturing and becoming more and more concerned about the trends in Russia itself. Several waves of protests or discontents as such were taking place when there were those very famous works released by Alexei Navalny about Prime Minister Medvedev, about President himself. When the pension reform was very quickly put into fast track, it was also that kind of mood. The newer trend in Russia is about very big concern about waste management, and that also created a lot of very organized, well organized, well thought through actions, not in the central city as such, but in the regions which were considered as possible regions to receive this waste. And finally, as I mentioned, and maybe those of you who followed a little bit the most recent developments of the summer, the municipal elections and how many people were involved and what the repercussions for those who were involved are. Now we have a series of criminal and administrative charges, and this is has received the name of the Moscow affair. So people have really already, several people, 7 people were already sentenced. These are just some of their additional points to perhaps give some of you interested to look into further newer names who are working in different fields, but all of them are presenting very strong activist positions and helping their younger people looking for the ways to improve their societal environment in Russia to better. To something better. And as a summary, I would have it basically just summed up of what I have mentioned so far. And as Professor Brown was giving me signs, I must finish by this. And thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Right, okay, so last of all, I'm going to be speaking about joint economic activities on the disputed islands, and with the subtitle, What Are They Good For? And when I was planning to put this together, I was anticipating that this talk would take place just after the pilot tourism trip to the disputed islands had concluded. But as I'll go on to explain a little bit later on, that has not actually taken place. But my starting point here is to look at what Abe's ultimate goal is when it comes to the islands issue. Now, I'm only going to be speaking about one part of this, but it seems to be quite clear, reading between the lines, that his ultimate goal is a 2+ agreement. 2 islands plus joint economic activities on the islands. Now, the government says that their position has not changed. They insist that there has not been an abandonment of Japan's claims to the two larger islands. But really, if you look more closely, that does seem to be the case. And this isn't the main focus of what I'm going to talk about, but just to mention this at the start, the clearest evidence of this seems to be the agreement reached in November 2018 when Putin and Abe met in Singapore, agreeing to advance the talks based on the 1956 Japan-Soviet Joint Declaration. The significance of this being that that agreement makes no mention of the two larger islands. It does, however, say that the smaller islands would be transferred to Japan after the signature of a peace treaty. So that's why it seems that two islands is the goal. But today, my main focus is rather the second part of Abe's goal, which is joint economic projects on the islands. This is not a new idea. It was something that was emphasized during the late 1990s, but it very much came back, especially in December 2016. You'll recall Putin's visit to Japan, where he was invited to visit Abe's home prefecture. They met in Nagato, and the idea was they would get into the onsen together and resolve all of the problems in Japan-Russia relations. It didn't quite turn out that way. Putin didn't seem so keen on going in the bath with Abe, but they did come away with an agreement which was presented as being highly significant. An agreement to discuss, or rather commence discussions, on a special arrangement for undertaking joint economic activity on the four islands. Now, I have it in the Japanese as well, emphasizing this special arrangement. This was something which was seen as very important for the Japanese side, because the special arrangement was interpreted as being that these joint economic activities would not be conducted under Russian jurisdiction. Instead, there would be a special legal arrangement of some sort which would permit Japanese economic activities on the islands without tacitly acknowledging Russian sovereignty. So this is where these talks began about conducting these economic activities. I should say this is entirely separate from Abe's other 8-point economic cooperation plan for economic projects elsewhere within Russia. This is just about cooperation on the disputed islands. Okay, so what happened next? They had that initial agreement in December 2016, and then the next year, there was the appearance of progress. You might recall that Abe has made rather a habit of traveling to Vladivostok for the Eastern Economic Forum. He's been 4 years in a row. And during his visit in September 2017, they reached an agreement to prioritize joint economic activities on the disputed islands in these 5 specific areas. And so the media began to focus about, this was going to be about uni, sea urchin, and strawberries. This was what the deal was going to be about. More fully, what was agreed was that they would prioritize cooperation in aquaculture, so that's the sea urchins, about greenhouse cultivation of fruit and vegetables, on tourism, wind power, and garbage volume reduction measures. There was also joint survey visits, with 2 of them taking place in 2017, and a third one occurring in October 2018. And that's the picture from one of those visits. And it's worth highlighting the gentleman on the left there, because he has played a very prominent role in this. He's a special advisor to Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Hasegawa. And there he is pictured on one of these joint survey visits with the then governor of Sakhalin, which administers the islands, Koizumi. And so what they were doing there is looking at potential sites for developing aquaculture, for locations for having these greenhouses, and it really looked quite promising. And you can understand what the Prime Minister's office were thinking in promoting this. This is the idea that they have been negotiating or trying to negotiate about the return of this territory for many decades, not making very much progress. And so this was a shift from talking about sovereignty to gaining access, with the hope that ultimately the two small islands would be returned, and then at least Japan would gain access via these economic activities to the two larger islands, with perhaps the hope that once you begin to gain access, once you begin to have Japanese citizens going there more frequently, who knows in the long term. So that was the idea. But as we'll see, things have not turned out quite as hoped. Because whilst they made some quite good progress as to the proposed contents of the joint economic activities, as yet there's been much less progress when it comes to legal obstacles. So they actually got to the stage of discussing the types of strawberries that would be cultivated on the islands, but they didn't actually get around to really resolving what would be the legal jurisdiction under which these projects would operate, all of the issues to do with customs, sanitary, phytosanitary standards, and all the rest of it. And you can imagine the enormous difficulties that could arise if you didn't have a clearly agreed framework for these legal issues. What if a Japanese worker involved in these projects is accused of a crime? To whom are taxes paid? What are the standards when it comes to this particular type of sea urchin and all the rest of it? So these are serious issues which needed to be resolved. But as the talks went on, as these visits continued, there was very little progress in this particular area. And in addition to that question of legal jurisdiction, there was also the matter of what would be the framework to permit Japanese workers to travel to the islands to participate in these economic programs, or indeed Japanese tourists. You'll recall perhaps that there is an existing visa-free framework which functions for humanitarian purposes, principally to take former Japanese residents of the islands and their families to visit grave sites on the islands. But that is specifically for humanitarian purposes. It's not for economic reasons. And the Russian side has said that if you want to have the economic projects, we need a new framework which will permit visa-free access for economic purposes. And there have been some indications that the Russian side's proposal is that, well, rather than just having a visa-free arrangement to allow access to the islands, why don't we actually go further, be more ambitious, and instead have a visa-free agreement that would apply to all of Sakhalin, including the disputed islands, and all of Hokkaido as well, as a sort of trans-border agreement. So that was another obstacle, not seeing eye to eye on that issue. So when it got to 2019, there seemed to be a feeling of stagnation. There seemed to be a recognition that focusing on these 5 priority areas was not achieving anything. And it seemed to me that when it came to the Osaka meeting on the sidelines of the G20, there was an enthusiasm from the Japanese side to just try and get something going. So at that meeting, when Putin visited Osaka, they agreed to focus on just the issue of waste management and on tourism, with the belief that those 2 areas would require would entail fewer legal obstacles than some of the more difficult ones, such as greenhouse agriculture. So they agreed in Osaka to conduct pilot projects by the end of 2019. So here we are now with this issue of the pilot projects. Now, in a sense, something has happened, because in the area of waste management, you had Russian officials visiting Nemuro, the closest point in Hokkaido to the disputed islands, in August, and then a return visit by Japanese officials. But really, this is terribly disappointing from the hopes of December 2016, if really all you're having is an exchange of waste management officials that wouldn't really require any special arrangements. So more interesting was this proposal to finally conduct a pilot trip to the disputed islands for Japanese tourists. This was initially scheduled to begin on the 9th of October and to conclude on the 16th. And the idea was that the Japanese tourists, around 50 in number, including some Japanese officials, would spend, first of all, 2 days in northeast Hokkaido, then would travel by boat to the island of Kunashir and then on to Iturup. And on those islands, they would visit the Orthodox cathedral that you have pictured there, which is on Kunashir. A museum was mentioned as well, hot springs, and visiting the White Cliffs on Iturup as well. Bit of a downside to this trip is that it was apparently going to cost 34 man, which is quite a price for a short trip. But ultimately, it didn't occur. The day before they were due to depart by plane for Nakashibetsu from Tokyo, the Russian side said that, I'm sorry, we're going to have to postpone. So this already significantly scaled down joint economic project ended up not going ahead at all. It has, however, been suggested that it's going to be rescheduled quite quickly, with the hope that it will now begin on the 27th of October. Regarding the reasons for the postponement, there's been no clear information given. The hints are, however, that this was perhaps the local authorities in Sakhalin region that either weren't ready or perhaps were keen to throw a spanner into the works. It wasn't seen as a political sign from Moscow, but at the moment it's just speculation as to the reason. But even if this pilot trip goes ahead, my interpretation of it is that there are still significant problems that remain. Let's say that that pilot tourism trip begins as now planned, potentially on the 27th of October. Let's say that it goes without a hitch, is a great success, the tourists are very happy. Still, there are significant problems which indicate that the Abe administration's hopes for these joint economic projects are far from being fully fulfilled. And that is because the legal questions still have not been resolved. This pilot tourism trip is actually taking place as a one-off under the existing humanitarian visa framework, with the indication being that if it's going to be repeated, if it's going to become a regular thing for Japanese tourists, then that new visa-free framework for economic purposes will need to be created. In addition to that, the Russian side shows no signs of compromising on the fundamental legal issue. You had Foreign Minister Lavrov saying in August of this year, we cannot agree to introduction on our territory of a jurisdiction that is not based on Russian law. Meaning that that initial hope from the Japanese side that this would be based on a special arrangement, a special framework, that also doesn't seem to be being realized. More broadly, it's becoming apparent that perhaps Japan made a mistake in focusing on the content of these projects before actually settling on the legal framework. Because all that has occurred is a raising of expectations that ultimately have been dashed. There are further problems too. Initially, when this was announced, the community in northeast Hokkaido, which is the home to many of the former Japanese residents of the islands, there was an enthusiasm for these projects, in the belief that they would bring economic benefits not just to the Russian-administered islands, but to the local Japanese community in Hokkaido as well. But now that the focus has shifted away from greenhouse agriculture and aquaculture, if it's just going to be tourism and waste management, there seem to be very few benefits to the local community around Nemuro, leading to some local people really thinking, what is the purpose of these projects? Is it simply paying for the development of territory under Russian control? And also there seems to be the potential issue that perhaps the Japanese government has miscalculated the enthusiasm of local Russians on the islands for these projects. There seems to have been the belief that if Japan was putting money into the islands, this would be enormously welcomed by the around 17,500 Russians who live on the disputed islands. However, actually, there seems to be a lot of caution. the residents of these islands certainly do want development. But their real hope is that that development will come from the federal Russian government and also from the Sakhalin regional government. There seem to be some concerns that joint economic projects on the islands would be something of a Japanese Trojan horse. And finally, when it comes to problems, there is the fact that Russia is proceeding with development of these islands without Japanese assistance. During the 1990s, the conditions on the islands were really desperate, but the situation in recent years has steadily become better. And in particular, there's been some significant investment just over the last few years with a new airport, new infrastructure of other sorts as well. And then just recently, the opening of that facility you can see on the slide there. This is now Russia's largest fish processing plant, opened on the island of Shikotan, with the formal opening being overseen by President Putin at the Vladivostok Eastern Economic Forum, at which Prime Minister Abe was present. One interpretation of that being that this could be seen as something of a diplomatic insult to Prime Minister Abe, with the Russian president overseeing the opening of this facility whilst Abe was in Russia on an island that under the 1956 agreement, Moscow has agreed to transfer after the signing of a peace treaty. Okay, so to try and bring together all of these points, my initial subtitle is, what are these joint economic projects good for? Now, I don't want to conclude absolutely nothing. I think that there is a degree of inventive thinking, of creative thinking from the Abe administration in proposing these. But after around 3 years since they were initially proposed, with no really significant progress on this issue, I think that these joint economic projects are not going to be the significant development that Prime Minister Abe and his advisors have really hoped for. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So we now have really a good amount of time for questions. And hopefully you will have some questions of your own, many of them indeed. I'm going to, however, first of all, start with just 2 very quick questions of my own to get us started. So firstly, to Mr. Koizumi, I wanted to ask, do you think that Russia's growing military presence north of Japan poses any real threat to Japan's national security, or is this purely about Russian defensive goals in the Far East? So that was the question to you, and then a brief question also to Elena. I wondered about the national projects, which are now such a focus in Russia as a way of improving the economy and also to try and tackle some of the public dissatisfaction. Now, the Japanese government has proposed to link its own 8-point economic cooperation plan with those national projects. So I wanted to ask, what potential do you see for those national projects, and can Japan contribute to them in any meaningful way?
Thank you very much for your question, Dr. Brown. Technically speaking, my answer is not so much. As you see, Russia's growing military assets in Northern Territory is quite limited still. And infrastructure to support and host them is also limited. So Russia is increasing its performance, its military asset, but number is not so much that we should feel military threat from them. But Russia is exploiting such military asset in Northern Territory as the leverage against Japan. As I said, yes, Northern Territory is very important place for Russian generals and admirals, but a country's foreign policy is not formed only from the military point of view. Ordinarily, they are formed by diplomatic and economic other considerations, and they become the foreign policy toward a country. So we should be very careful about Russia's claim that we cannot give up the islands because it is militarily important. Rather, I think now Russia is exploiting them as the leverage against Japan. Thank you.
All right, so perhaps I would like to clarify a little bit. Did you ask about national projects as such, or those projects which are like territories of advanced development?
The national projects, the 12 of them, I think.
All right. So yeah, certainly from both perspectives, either we're speaking of national projects of entire Russia, or those which are formed in a group of territories of advanced development, and many of those are located in the Far East. On all these accounts, I think, objectively speaking, their interest from Russian side, of course, is there, because increasingly some concerns of the Russian government, as I have mentioned, are becoming clear with waste management, because people are very, very dissatisfied with the quality of their public works which are being presented on that account. And in fact, indeed, the protests are taking very massive scale in northern regions in Russia, where it was initially planned to simply relocate the waste, not doing much beyond that. So having cooperation with Japan on these accounts of waste management, of healthcare, of developing green renewable energy, for Russia it becomes more and more a point of interest, because the domestic demand for those topics is obviously very, very ripe.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll stop asking questions. We have a microphone at the back, so if you have a question, please line up there, and please identify yourself and keep your question short, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabor from Hungarian Embassy, and I would have two questions. One is, we're speaking of 4 islands, and the solution of 2 plus something has been on the table, or has been talked about ever since 1956, and that 2 is better than 0. But do you think any Japanese political leader would survive politically if he or she just gave up the claim of the other 2 islands, which is a lot more important than the 2 smaller ones? And my other question was, 4 islands, Russia will never give them back, and Japan is in no position of take them back. But Professor Shadrina's presentation inspired me that the real threat in case of Russia is not Japan or Japanese claims over these islands, but the depopulation of the Russian Far East territories. And while less and less Russian people are living there, there are hundreds of millions south of the border. So what do you think about that situation? Is that those military capabilities posted on these Far East is not really there to deny Japan, but a threat from somewhere else? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Although I'm not expert of Japanese politics, But I think Japanese atmosphere of Japanese society has changed after the appearance of Abe administration. Before that, yes, most of the Japanese people believe that all 4 islands should be returned from Russia. But recently, Japanese people, especially young Japanese people, have some kind of feeling that it's impossible. So now I think Japanese society is accepting some kind of consideration that 2 islands is better trade. So if Japanese administration can conclude that 2 island compromise, it would be welcomed in today's Japan's atmosphere.
Well, I'll make a bit of a comment on the first question. So, could a Japanese politician survive? I think that statistically, we have some indications of the Japanese public's opinion. It depends on the survey, but there is an indication of a willingness to show flexibility, as Mr. Koizumi said. The option that often receives the largest support in those surveys is the transfer of 2 islands and not giving up on the other 2. So that 2 would come back and maybe a recognition that the other 2 would remain with Russia, but not actually giving them up. So that indicates that there is some area for negotiation, especially if a Japanese government were to actively prepare public opinion, which has not taken place. The Abe administration has stopped using the term inherent territory to describe the islands. It has stopped publicly describing them as under Russian occupation, but it has not gone further and actually tried to explain why it's so unlikely that the 2 larger islands would ever be returned, or indeed to explain the content of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which includes the wording of Japan giving up its claim to the Kuril Islands. So if the Japanese government were to be brave enough to make that case, I think that, yes, potentially the Japanese public could accept a 2-island deal, but not if it were to happen today without that preparation. Okay.
Let me make a supplement. Yes, if the resolution is a real transfer of 2 islands, it is acceptable for Japanese society, I think. But the proposal that President Putin made last year, September, in Vladivostok, was that I think it is just a rental of the surface of islands. It is completely unacceptable for Japanese society because what happened in 1945 summer was the invasion. And it was the invasion of the Japanese national sovereignty and the human rights of residents on the islands. And invasion to Japanese human rights can be complemented by Japanese government political measures, including some financial measures. But invasion to Japanese society cannot be resolved with the rental of surface of land. What we are talking about is not the surface of island, but our sovereignty. Thank you.
All right, taking the question on demography, security, I'll try to be as specific, but you may guess that it's not quite easy to answer this kind of question. So to put things in perspective, I just need to mention that indeed we're speaking of decreasing population in the Far East, even at a more rapid rate than in the rest of the country. If we compare the population of the Far East with the period of just the start of their market reforms, we have a decline of about 2 million. And when we refer to the Far East, it's actually 9 regions. It used to be 9 regions. This year, the government decided to somehow, maybe play a little bit with numbers. Effectively, it decided to join 2 other regions which are close to the Far East, include them in this Far East as a larger region. So let's say number-wise, we got somewhere back to 8 million population. Now, in this very large region, we have absolutely disadvantageous for a number of reasons. A region of Chukotka, which is very severe climate-wise and things like that. So the population there would be about less, I think, than 50,000. And it's very big in size, and it has a lot of resources, rich, and potentially could be, of course, of pretty big use. Kamchatka is also one of the regions which has a very negative trend in demographic area. So speaking of that shortage of working age population, in the Far East this problem is even larger. And for instance, in the recent years, the Far East started to receive larger number of workers from Central Asia, specifically from Kazakhstan, with whom Russia has a Eurasian Economic Union, from Uzbekistan, from Kyrgyzstan, and these positions are not only in the sector of low-paid jobs, but recently we started to see a more high-skilled personnel for hospitals, for schools, and other positions. So and nonetheless, we are seeing negative trends. So population, domestic population, and as statistics says, I just recently took a look, with higher education, university education, seem to be still leaving their Far Eastern regions, and we have some inflow of low qualified immigrants arriving to the Far East. So now, to what extent this problem could be anyhow resolved? It's difficult to answer straight away, but definitely the government is very concerned and trying to do something. Several times already I mentioned these territories of advanced development. There was also a program about 2 years ago launched, which is called the Far Eastern Hectare, meaning that anyone, any Russian could apply for a plot of land and start any kind of thing he wanted, and then the framework was extended to allow the same thing to foreigners. Yet we see very little being, in fact, done. Various reasons could be named for that. I could go further if there is a specific question, but for now, perhaps just would need to stop. Indeed, the question is quite sensitive. Thank you.
Well, we have a posse of questioners forming, so let's perhaps move on to the next one, please.
Yeah. My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm from the Austrian Business Council. Actually, well, thank you so much for the presentation. You actually answered almost all my questions, but I have 2 to go. The first one is a pretty difficult one, I think. Is it realistically possible for Japan to reconcile the relationship with the United States and Russia at the same time? That's point number 1. The second question is a more practical question. Some time ago, I asked Suzuki Muneo about if Japan would get back these islands, would the Japanese really want to go up there again, particularly those who are living in Hokkaido and so on? And the answer was, no, nobody wants to go. They just want to visit the graveyards over there. So what is your position about this point? Thank you.
Maybe I'll have a go at those to begin with. So on the first one about the involvement of the United States as well, it's of course an absolutely essential consideration. And that actually links with an implication of the previous question, which was, if I understand correctly, that maybe Japan could be somewhat of an appealing partner as an alternative to Russia's relations with China. And that certainly seems to be a hope amongst some within the Japanese government. But the problem there is, from the Russian side, it seems to be that when Russia looks at Japan, first and foremost, it sees a US ally. And that means that Japan cannot really be an alternative kind of partner within the region. It's just seen as an extension of US power. And this was confirmed, I think, recently by some comments made by Putin himself when he was talking about the apparent threat of missiles being deployed within East Asia after US withdrawal from the INF. And he was saying that on these questions of deployment, Japan does not have independence. Japan is not a fully sovereign country, was the implication. So that means that the involvement of the US here is absolutely crucial. And it means that whilst Russia-US relations are so negative, that also means that there are clear implications for Russia-Japan relations, making that relationship all the more difficult. Now, as to the issue of Suzuki Munio, a fascinating politician, I recently published an article about him, actually, in a sense, celebrating his return to national politics after his time in prison and his years being suspended from politics. Now, he is back, he meets regularly with the Prime Minister, and he's part of the sort of broader sort of advising network when it comes to Abe's Russia policy. He is a long advocate of a more kind of compromise solution about talking about Japanese investment on the islands. And so, yeah, I'm not at all surprised that he told you that the issue was not so much getting them back for Japanese to live on there. Part of the reason why he does advocate compromise is because he recognizes that elderly Japanese who are expelled from the islands are absolutely not going to live there. What about their children and grandchildren? Well, the population of Hokkaido overall is falling significantly. And so the idea that you would be able to repopulate these remote islands, which have very difficult conditions during the winter, which are fog-bound during other parts of the year, it's not clear what jobs would be available. You know, frankly, when you look at it that way, it does become clear that these islands are never going to be populated by a significant self-sustaining Japanese population again. And so that would add to the argument of people like Suzuki who are in favor of some sort of compromise solution.
He's two plus.
Yeah.
On the first question, I fully agree with Dr. Brown. Yes, it would be very complicated to achieve make relationship better at the same time with United States and Russia. But yes, United States is our principal partner to guarantee our security and foreign policy. And Russia doesn't have capability to provide what the United States can provide for us, including the extended nuclear deterrence or other security guarantee. And please recall what happened in the case of the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In the conflict, Armenia was Russia's former ally under the CSTO. But Russia didn't help Armenia and provided military equipment to Azerbaijan for oil money. And in 1994, in Bucharest Memorandum, Russia guaranteed the national security of Ukraine. After 20 years ago, Russian forces itself invaded Ukraine and destroyed territorial integrity of Ukraine. So it is, I think Russia is evil country, but it is Russia's strategic flexibility. Russia's national power and available resources for their foreign policy is quite limited. So they have any other way to do their business in such flexible way. So yes, Russia is our neighbor and inevitable partner in this Northeastern Asia, but our security should be relied on United States. And if the relationship with Russia hurts our relationship with United States, we should choose United States. This is my standpoint.
Next question, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Makoto Ishii from the University of Tokyo. I have a question related to Russia's foreign policy. So considering the fact that the US foreign policy has become more and more untransparent, while China seems no longer willing to conceal its power and bide its time, and as Russia cannot compete against the United States militarily, while itself is a weaker economic power in comparison with either Japan or Germany, do you think that Russia would be more willing to act in accordance with the current international law in pursuit of maximizing its national interest and its international status? Thank you.
Thank you very much. By my opinion, unstable world is very useful for Russia's world strategy. Russia's economic power, soft power, or other Russia's influence in the peacetime is quite limited. And it would be impossible to catch up or compensate such short or mid-term, I think. But in unstable world, Russia's influence is maximized because it's military power, military great power. So today's this turbulence in world order is quite useful for Russia. So Russia wouldn't prospect or hope the stable world in near or mid-term, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's a really interesting question about Russia and international law. Maybe a first point is that if you take the position of the Russian government, they would say, well, look, we are supporters of the United Nations to a great extent. We comply with international law. They would say that rather it's the United States that has been the ones to violate international law. They would point to the Balkans. They would point to Iraq. They would point to the way in which the resolution over Libya was stretched beyond its initial intention. So that, I think, would be what their response is. But that wouldn't be my view. I think that whilst it's true that the United States has violated international law on several occasions, that is also clearly true in the case of Russia. There's clearly the Ukraine example, but you can also point to other examples. I would point to the Skripal case as being clearly a violation of international norms and rules, other cases of hacking into various international organizations. But I would differ from Mr. Koizumi's view that I think it's a fascinating idea that an unstable world order is good for Russia. And I think that amongst the Russian strategists, that seems to be quite a widespread view. They seem to see opportunities. I think in the long term, my view is that Russia doesn't have the raw capabilities to really prosper in a world where the gloves are off, where international law is significantly undermined, where norms are out of the window. That sort of Hobbesian environment serves the most powerful states best. That's an environment in which the United States and China have enough economic and military heft to do well. At the moment, I think that Russia is performing well in terms of its own national interests in a very skillful foreign policy. I think it's also in some ways punching above its weight. But in the long term, in a world where international law is not respected, that's not good for what is essentially a middle-ranking power like Russia. So I think that in the long run, Russia would be better served by supporting international institutions and encouraging both China and the United States to do the same. Thank you.
My name is Yukio Kashiyama. I'm a former reporter of Sankei Shimbun, Japanese newspaper Sankei. And also I'm from northeast Hokkaido. I'm a strong sentiment to the whole for Northern Territory, Northern Ireland. I don't know whom I should ask this question, but then either Professor Koizumi or Professor Blum. Professor Blum said that Prime Minister Abe changed his ultimate goal. And his new goal, his new target is just 2 islands plus alpha. And then Professor Koizumi said Japanese society will accept this new target, considering the atmosphere of Japan. But in my private opinion, its new target, Prime Minister Abe's new target is completely wrong idea, because it means to abandon the 2 big islands, Kunashiri and Torofu. And as we know, the whole 4 islands are Japan's own territory from point of view or historical process or aspect of international law. So if we abandon this 2 islands, it means just to abandon our sovereignty. So it would bring a very bad effect to the problem of Senkaku Island issue with China, or Takeshima issue from South Korea. I really want to know how do you think that. And also, I want to ask to Professor Shadrina, as you know, the 1956 joint communique said clearly that the Soviet Union will turn 2 islands, Habomaiskutan, over Japan when the peace treaty are signed. Peace treaty negotiations still going on. But if Japan and Russia reached the final agreement, are Russia completely ready to hand over to Japan? This is my question.
Thank you very much for your question. I think Japan has only 2 options about territorial dispute, territorial problem. The first is claiming 4 islands, but in that case, we should be ready to claim it for next century, because Russia wouldn't have any intention to return them. And or we will be realist to return 2 island return option is not so bad trade, I think. And referring to the term return you mentioned, in 1956 Japanese-Soviet agreement, there is no word return, but just a transfer, передача in Russian. So what President Putin pointed out after the our Prime Minister Abe, the statement in Singapore last year was that there was a word transfer in the agreement, but there is no basement about the transfer. So the wording return or transfer is very important. And considering the word transfer is used in the 1956 agreement, so Russia's option for maneuvering to Japan is claiming that this is not returning, just transferring Russia's intention.
I very much agree with that, actually. I think that on that first point, you can make a case that Japan should not compromise. You can make a case that this is a question of sovereignty, this is a matter of principle, and that Japan should not give up on it. It should maintain a strong position. But if you do take that position, as Mr. Koizumi said exactly, you have to be prepared that that is not going to lead to the return of any or the transfer of any territory. You have to be prepared to make that argument decade after decade. So it really is a question of pragmatism versus principle. If you maintain a principled position, that's fine. That's, intellectually completely justifiable position, but it's not going to lead to any territory coming back to Japan. And it seems to be that Abe's position is rather more pragmatic, thinking that he would rather get some territory rather than remain consistent on a matter of principle. As to the other part of the question, yeah, I think that's a really interesting issue too. Would Russia actually fulfill that promise to transfer the two islands? Let's say that tomorrow Prime Minister Abe said, okay, let's immediately sign a peace treaty with no preconditions. Would then Russia move to transfer the two islands as is suggested by the 1956 agreement? I have serious doubts. I think that the Russian public would be shocked by the idea of giving over that territory. I think also there are indications from previous comments by the Russian leadership that they've been looking to find wiggle room in the 1956 agreement, raising questions about what exactly does it mean to talk about transfer. Sovereignty is not mentioned in that issue. So I think that if the peace treaty was signed, it's far from guaranteed that anytime soon, even the two small islands would come back to Japan. And a final point on that is that in recent times, the Russian side has also very much emphasized their concern about the idea of US forces appearing on any transferred territory. Now, I think this is very much hypothetical. I don't think the US is at all interested in having facilities there. If they were so interested, they could have a big military base near Nemuro. They're not interested. So I think it's somewhat hypothetical, but nonetheless, the fact that Russia has raised that issue again suggests that they are far from preparing to transfer any territory, even those two small ones, which just count for 7% of the total disputed landmass. And I think was it part for you?
Yeah, I think because the question was exactly also directed to me, so I need to somehow respond to it. Indeed, I could give a very hypothetical answer, and it could be, of course, yes or no, and the scenario of yes could be on the instance if, let's say, again, the topic, the area which is closer to my expertise is economy. If, let's say, the situation in Russia becomes very, very hard economically, and Russia would look for some cooperation based on investment or other kind of supports, be that perhaps loans or, hypothetically we can think of anything. Perhaps this could be a possible scenario, because I'm not in this area, as you may have already learned, but to the extent I know, there was such discussion in the early 90s when Russia was really struggling economically. So who knows? So yes could be when the situation is very, very bad. And also it could be yes when, let's say, their situation is vice versa, very, very good. So people are living very comfortable, very nice, satisfying lives. The government is very kind and very responsive to not only to domestic issues, but also to foreign demands, and indeed assumes and accepts their right of some nations, Japan in particular case, for their territories. So it could be also yes in a very, very positive way. And also it could be an answer no, and again it could be two scenarios. If the situation in Russia is very bad, and the government would be very strong, responding to all kinds of domestic challenges, and equally so trying to present a stronger position on foreign affairs. And equally, no could be if Russia does very well, it again becomes very assertive and doesn't feel that it needs anyone else. As something of a kind was in their early 2000s, through their global crisis, in fact, or through their time when President Putin had his Munich speech in 2007, something like that. So yes and no are possible, if you will. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Next question, please.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. My name is Theo Peters. I'm from the Dutch embassy here in Tokyo. Partly my question has been answered in relation to the previous question, but partly it still remains, so let me pose it anyway. Dr. Brown, you described how there was a shift from talking about sovereignty towards talking about access or joint development. And you seem to conclude that the project will not actually bring the Japanese government or the Abe government what they were hoping for. So should we conclude then that actually the ultimate goal of a return of the islands or a transfer of sovereignty of the islands has become even more remote than it was before? If you listen to all three presentations, that's what it sounds like, that chances have gotten slimmer of something like that happening in the future. Do you agree with that it has become more remote? And do you think, and maybe it's difficult to answer, but do you still think it is feasible? Is it still possible that it would happen in the future? And then finally, if you believe it would be feasible, and you imagine yourself to be the principal advisor to the Abe government, what would be your policy advice to Prime Minister Abe, what he should do to realize the return of the islands?
Thank you. So is it feasible? Are the chances remote? Yeah, very remote, I would say. I think that really they've perhaps been remote for a very long time, and I don't think anything that Abe has done has really brought them closer. And the way that I think about this is as an issue of incentives. I think the Russian government is very rational on this point. They look at the situation and they think, what would we gain by transferring this territory? What would we gain by compromising on this issue? So Japan is already offering economic cooperation, so we don't gain there. We end up stirring up a lot of annoyance among the Russian population. So we lose out there. What else can Japan offer? Can Japan be an alternative to China? Not really. I think the Russian side sees Japan as a sort of fading economic power with perhaps its best days behind it. We hope that that's not the case, but that is perhaps the way it's sometimes seen within Moscow. And also to reiterate that point I made earlier, which was that the Russian side sees Japan as very much an extension of the United States, and so you don't really make territorial concessions to a country so closely allied with a country that's now a strategic rival of Russia. So for all of those reasons, I don't see a deal as really being feasible. But I'm not entirely pessimistic. There are still lots of good reasons to cooperate with Russia. If you just concentrate on this territorial issue, you're not really going to get that far. If you maintain absurdly high hopes that you can break through all of the historical barriers and make a deal, then you're also going to be disappointed. But you can still find areas in which to cooperate on certain security issues at a low level, on, for example, search and rescue operations. You can engage in humanitarian, cultural exchanges, mutually beneficial economic activities as well. But if you believe that all of that is going to lead to a breakthrough, then, I mean, you're listening to the wrong people. And there are some signs that maybe that is happening within Japan, with perhaps the Ministry of Foreign Affairs not being so closely involved in this particular topic, a lot of the decisions coming directly out of the Prime Minister's office. And, well, it's the Russia experts are in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not in the Kante.
Thank you very much. My advice for Prime Minister Abe would be that to be desperate in positive way. So as Dr. Brown explained, Russia has no intention or no merit to return 4 islands to Japan. And yes, as I mentioned, I think 2 islands resolution is not so bad trade, but it is now clear that Russia doesn't have any intention to return 2 islands. So option left for us is to claim 4 islands for next century. So yes, it's desperate, but I'm positive because it is our なんていうのかな、long way to counter Russia, neighboring that troublesome big country. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hiroshi Kamura, and so foreign policy watcher. And so I have 2 questions. So one is the Russia cheap defense. So Professor Koizumi mentioned nuclear weapons, but also Russia is investing a lot on cyber warfare to politically manipulate the enemy. So how much threat can Russia give to Japan through cyber attack capabilities? So there are some examples, Brexit and Trump, and also Russia paralyzed Estonia in 2007 and 2008. So that's the first question. And the second question is Far East demography. So I hear that there are the Russian Far East lacks high-skilled, high education jobs. But well, during the Putin era, I think Russia moved defense jobs, defense factories for defense and high-tech factories from former Ukraine and Ural to Komsomolsk na Amur. And also, Russia made a rocket site, space rocket site in Vostochny. So how these facilities place an impact on Far East jobs and demography? Thank you.
So thank you for that question. I'm afraid in order to get through all of them, I'll encourage you to make a note of your answer. And if we could take the other questions that remain as well, and then hopefully we can provide answers to all of them. So if we could have the next questioner, please.
Hi, I'm Japanese from Hokkaido, and I would like to make a comment about Dr. Koizumi's answer to Dr. Brown, because you said young Japanese accept 2 islands resolution, and I do not think so. Young Japanese are very disappointed and feeling deceived by Russia and Abe. Now, even more 2 island resolution is not acceptable. That is my feeling from my people around. And another question. Again, Dr. Koizumi said threat to Hokkaido is not increasing, but I doubt it, because Russia justifying invasion to Hokkaido by Japan because Japan was allied with Germany, and same rhetoric could be applied to Japan and the US alliance. And what do you think? And people who favor Suzuki Muneo likes the word term realistic resolution, but is it really realistic? That is my final question. Thank you.
Next question, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Raina. I'm a former student of Professor Brown. I have a quick question on a bit of history. I was wondering why Russia even bothered to make this agreement in 1957-6 with ambiguous wordings such as transfer if they had no intentions of transferring in the first place?
Thank you.
Richard Salmons from TUJ. Just a quick question for Professor Koizumi. Do we see Russian Far East forces playing much of a role in regional diplomacy, sort of the area of defense diplomacy, such as joint exercises and engagement with regional partners and potential partners around the Asia-Pacific region?
Hi, my name is Maxim Nesterov. I have a deep connection to Russian state. I have a Russian citizenship, and I have a question for all of you. If the Russian state would return the islands to Japan, the President Putin's reputation would definitely decrease for now. Like, Russia has a strong connection to the Crimea, to the northern islands, and they claim these islands and the Crimea as their territory. So will Japan have a better chance of getting islands back after president election in 2024? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Pedro, and I'm from the United States. But I have a question for you. In regards to these islands, I understand why Japan wants to regain them. And Japan isn't the only country which has territorial disputes for islands. I would give as an example, Argentina wants the Falkland Islands from Great Britain, and they actually tried to forcefully take them back. And it didn't work out for them. And I understand throughout history, reading and analyzing, that the only thing that's genuinely yours is that which you can take and defend, right? So a lot of people make territorial claims, but at the end of the day, the people who can defend that territory are the people who own it. The same way that the Native Americans in America are very mad that the land isn't theirs anymore. But I have a question in regards to this. I was reading in the past about the Battle of Tsushima, in where the Japanese had a territorial dispute with the Russians and obliterated 2/3 of their navy. And also, I was wondering whether, I know there's certain pressure to change the Japanese constitution in regards to the defense forces. And would you see Japan changing that and getting more aggressive in regards to taking what's theirs? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got quite a bit of work to do in the last 14 minutes. So maybe we'll go down the line, and there were a lot of questions there, but if you could do your best to get through those.
Thank you for many active questions. First of all, we have to distinct the cyber and information operation of Russia. Russia's cyber operation is quite sophisticated, but part of cyber operation is being conducted as Russia's military operation to paralyze enemies' social infrastructures. And other cyber operation is the part of espionage operation by intelligence organs like FSB or SBR. And the information operation is solely conducted by information organs, especially SBR. And in my opinion, Russia's information operation in Japan is not so active because Japan is not the main front of Russia's manipulation operation. But recently, Japanese media in Okinawa enlisted the interview of Gradziev, Putin's economic advisor, and claimed that Japan should be more friendly to Russia and for returning 4 islands. It is the recent new development, and I'm very warningful about it. And about demography and military industry in Far East, yes, demography is heavily affecting the Russia's military industrial posture. But recently, Russian military industrial complex is suffering from the decreasing state order from Russian government. So now they are decreasing their staff in military factories and construction bureaus. So I think now military industry complex is the first one, most suffered from demographic issues. Rather, Russian military is more suffered from demographic decreasing because their 1 million army is now staffed by conscript and construct soldiers, but construct soldiers are not popular jobs among Russian young people because it's very dangerous job. So Russian military needs more population, but the prospect of the improvement of the demographic situation is not, I think, so probable. And yes, I have a comment from a woman from Hokkaido. Yes, I have to apologize if I hurt your sentiment. And as I mentioned, I'm not an expert of the Japanese politics, but please understand, I mentioned just about the general trend of the Japanese people. And about threat to Hokkaido, yes, politically, Russia is still a great threat for security and independence. But I'm talking about the very technical aspect of Russian military posture in Northern Territory and the Far East, especially in Eastern Military District. Their ground force is just 80,000. You know, just half size of a ground self-defense force. So, of course, politically they are threat, but technically and military they are not great threat. Of course, they are still one of our potential threat. And about Mr. Suzuki Muno, I'm refraining from talking about him. And about defense diplomacy, yes. Despite Russia's limited military capability in Far East, but their political presence is quite big and recently getting bigger in recent years. And the most important point is that they are getting closer to China in military aspect. Last year, Chinese People's Liberation Army firstly joined Russia's large-scale military exercise named Vostok 2018. It was very shocking because the Vostok exercise is the war game against China. And this year, Russia and China conducted joint flight by strategic bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And recently, President Putin mentioned that Russia is now supporting the construction of China's indigenous early warning system. Those new development indicates that Russia and China is coming into the new level of defense cooperation. So the defense diplomacy in Eastern Asia will be getting more important, I think. Thank you.
I will just address two questions which I thought would be within the area of my some knowledge or expertise. So the question about, once again, although I'm not an expert in demography, nonetheless, I do know quite a bit about that. So demography and military complex or military industrial complex in the Far East. Indeed, in the Far East, there was a very well-known, established plant in Komsomolsk now Amur, on Amur, where there were MiGs produced all along, and since early 90s, there were increasing contacts with China, selling their crafts themselves and documents allowing to produce these crafts in China. Indeed, as their market reforms were progressing and that affected economic situation and population was discouraged to remain in the Far East, because early on there were quite significant bonuses for people to work in the Far East. So nowadays, indeed, we register a lack of highly qualified, necessary personnel for the military-industrial complex. And what is being started these days, speaking of places like Komsomolsk-na-Amur, Vostochny, and shipbuilding yards Zvezda, those are working, opening up the calls for their vacant positions, and people, there are different schemes, like shifting scheme. People would come to work and then return to their home places, which could be very far away in the central Russia. But indeed, this is a very significant problem. I've been told about this, in fact, and I just need to agree with you. Your question was a very precise one. And again, answering or somehow reflecting to a question about what if the two islands would be returned, whether that would affect the reputation of Putin or not. Definitely so, and again, it could be two scenarios. If Putin feels very strong support, he would probably consider doing something like that, because I think it wasn't completely out of the blue that he went during the Eastern Economic Forum and suggested, Abe, let us do something about that. So when he feels that he is very highly supported, he may indeed go ahead with steps like that. He has already a reputation of a gatherer of Russian lands, so he may consider something, and we know that he acts in a very unexpected way, so that's one of the things. And also, of course, there could be a negative answer to this question, because what we saw as a kind of not necessarily very strong trend, but nonetheless in the most recent years, the support approval rates of the Russian president tend to decline, and that also has been mentioned in the early 2000s as a very important factor which stopped the Russian government from getting closer to discussing their territorial dispute with Japan. Again, remembering the instances of 2004 when Russia regulated their dispute with China over their Ussuriysky Island. And remember in 2009 when Russia went ahead and fixed issues with Norway, yet we do have some examples of the kind, and perhaps studying those cases would help understanding better the prospects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see Robert is lurking there, so I'll have to be very, very quick. So just touch on a few of those questions. The one about young Japanese, whether they're willing to accept two. I just don't think we have the real breakdown of the data to be able to answer that. Clearly, there is some statistical information to indicate that young Japanese have a slightly more positive attitude towards Russia than older generations. Overall, the Japanese population still has quite a negative view towards Russia, but there is a slightly more positive attitude among younger cohorts. Purely anecdotally, also, the Putin calendars in Japan are very popular as well. Apparently they sell out each year at Loft, but I don't think we can really base too many conclusions on that. Another one from Reina about why make the deal in 1956. Well, prior to the deal in 1956, Russia and Japan, the Soviet Union and Japan were still in a state of war. That although there's still to this day no peace treaty, the state of war has already been ended. That happened in '56, and I think at that time Moscow was genuine in its belief that a fair deal to end this was the Soviet Union takes the two larger islands and the two smaller ones, which are much closer to Hokkaido, which is strategically not so important and are historically much more clearly part of Hokkaido. It would be fair to return them. So I think that was the genuine intention at the time. Since then, however, these islands have been under Russian or Soviet administration for many decades, and I think that Moscow now believes that the situation has simply changed. Japan, in a sense, had a chance in the mid-1950s, but Moscow says that in part due to the intervention of the United States, they didn't take that opportunity, and now perhaps that chance is now gone. As to after Putin, do things become easier? Is a deal possible? I don't think so. I think that within Russia, the narrative that these islands were gained through sacrifice in World War II, language about these islands being taken with the blood of our grandfathers, this narrative is deeply rooted, even if you can question its accuracy. And so a post kind of Putin Russia, you would expect the Russian leader would probably be weaker than Putin. So if Putin didn't make this deal, why would a weaker Russian leader do it, knowing that they're going to get the backlash that would inevitably follow? And then last of all, that question about Japanese constitution, would Japan take more of a robust kind of position? That got me thinking about Maruyama. Do people remember the Diet member who visited the islands after 10 shots of, it wasn't vodka, it was brandy, I think, made some comments about Japan will have to, well, raise the question about taking them back through war. That is the talk of a drunk. It's not serious, even after any constitutional change, which would probably be really quite minor. It is unthinkable. And you can just see the way that Mr. Maruyama was treated after that everyone was repulsed by this idea. Japan certainly is not going to take these islands back by force. Thank you very much.